Hey everybody. In this recording, we're going to highlight several points from the chapter which focuses on aggression. Let's get started. If this were the face-to-face class, we would pause now and do an interactive activity. But I've adapted this lecture so that you're able to do the interactive activities on your own. I will draw your attention here, though, to a great website that focuses on the role of social psychology and social psych concepts in some of the more heinous acts of aggression worldwide. The website has a particular emphasis in trying to lessen and decrease the frequency and severity of those heinous acts of violence. So the focus is on understanding, but the focus also is on lessening and improving the situation, lessening the likelihood for those types of acts to reoccur, and improving the situation on the outcome. First up, what is aggression? Your textbook defines aggression as physical, verbal, or relational behavior that is intended to harm. There are a number of different forms of aggression. I know that you're probably very well aware of several, if not all of these, but we will go over those briefly. There's physical aggression, verbal aggression, relational aggression, hostile, and also instrumental. Physical and verbal are just as they are described. Relational aggression may be a term that's newer to some of you, but the concept I'm pretty sure is not. So relational aggression refers to behavior that is intended to harm someone, but that behavior is the form that attempts to manipulate peer friendships, social networks, etc. So sometimes you'll hear the phrase cyberbullying or online bullying. Those are forms of relational aggression. Also, if you've seen the movie Mean Girls, I know it's a bit of a cult classic, but it captures very, very well relational aggression. And so it refers to starting rumors, manipulating peer groups such that, for example, telling people, hey, don't be friends with so-and-so, don't respond to so-and-so. Here's a mean picture or a meme or a GIF that I've made about so-and-so, and I want you to spread it. And let's laugh at him or her together to get him or her to do a certain thing or to be a certain way. So those are some examples of relational aggression. Another way to analyze aggression is to break it down into hostile versus instrumental. Hostile or hot aggression is driven by anger. It's usually an instantaneous thing. It's a reaction to some occurrence. So it's driven by anger, and it's hot, if you will, and performed as an end in and of itself. Instrumental, on the other hand, is sometimes referred to as cold aggression, and it is aggression that is a calculating form. So it typically is not a direct result of an occurrence such that the emotion bubbles up and causes that person to lash out in that instant. It's more of a calculating, longer term type of aggression. And it is not seen as the end, it is seen as a means to an end. Here is an example of aggression, or if this were the in-class experience, I would pause to let you all read this slide. So please press pause and read this slide. Then after you have paused to read the slide, I will ask you to answer the question, do you think that the United States Tennis Association was carrying out an act of aggression toward Taylor Townsend when they instructed her to not compete in matches? Now, technically, there's no right or wrong answer, but it is, or rather, it was an act of aggression. And so I will let you ponder the ways in which it was an act of aggression, how it was perceived by Taylor and many other people who went on record responding to it with righteous indignation. And I'll also let you ponder on the type of aggression you think the USTA was demonstrating toward Taylor Townsend in this example. Okay, so what are some prominent theories of aggression that help to explain why aggression might result and what aggression is? We have Freud's hydraulic theory, which essentially suggests we are born with life and death energies. And as energy can be neither created nor destroyed, we are pretty much born with all the energy we're ever going to have. And throughout the lifespan, those energies can certainly change forms. One can be stronger than another, your eros or your life energy, and your thanatos or your death energy. One can be stronger than the other, but it is neither created nor destroyed. And people who are more aggressive are those people whose thanatos or death energy is stronger than their life energy or their eros. Now, some people, according to Freud's theory, would be more aggressive toward themselves, while other people might be more aggressive toward others. But in both cases, those people who are going to show stronger levels or higher levels of aggression, they're going to have stronger thanatos or death energies than eros, life energies. The evolutionary perspective also provides some insight here on who is more likely to be aggressive than not, also on why people are aggressive. So David Buss and his colleagues suggest it has a survival value, such that in the past, people who lived hundreds and hundreds of years ago, those of them who were able to be aggressive were more likely to survive the social and physical environment, and they were more likely to procreate because they had the genes that lent themselves to survival. And that made them hot in the eyes of the opposite sex. So, in the past, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, those people who had higher levels of aggression were able to maintain their resources a lot better, access to water, access to food. They were able to defend themselves a lot better. They were better able to intimidate and eliminate rivals for partners so that they could procreate. And they were also better at deterring mates from infidelity. So, because they were better able to do all of those things, they became our ancestors. And those people who were not able to do those things did not become anyone's ancestors because they did not survive. Biochemical theories. There are a number of biochemical theories. The three that we'll focus on here relate to alcohol consumption, testosterone, and serotonin. So alcohol, you may remember this from other classes, is what? Is it a stimulant or is it a depressant? Think about what happens when a person drinks. And as they consume more and more alcohol, what tends to happen? Do they tend to speed up or do they tend to slow down? Do their inhibitions get stronger, or do their inhibitions get weaker? So hopefully through that line of questioning, it's drawing out the point that alcohol certainly is a disinhibitor. It has the ability to, as people call it, liquid courage. It has the ability to, unfortunately, make our common sense and good rational decision making fall by the wayside. So when it comes to aggression, people who are drunker or who are more intoxicated are going to have a higher likelihood to aggress and to resort to violence, pardon me. Testosterone. In your textbook, Myers cites several studies that look at people who are imprisoned for various crimes. And when comparing people who are in prison for white-collar crimes versus blue-collar crimes, I just caught the term blue-collar crime. I don't like that phrase, but it is a widely used phrase. But people who are imprisoned for violent crimes, I'll put it that way, do have a higher average level of testosterone. When you think about it, testosterone is associated with males and masculinity. So a lot of times we'll refer to it as the male hormone, whereas estrogen is referred to as the female hormone. And so the male hormone is associated with a larger size, like physically speaking, a larger size, a deeper voice, a greater likelihood toward aggression, etc. And so while males do on average have higher levels of testosterone, males also do on average commit more violent crimes. So there is an association there, and I could make several more points, but I try to keep these videos shorter rather than longer, so I'll just encourage you to read more about the link between testosterone and aggression in your textbook. Also, serotonin. Lower levels of serotonin are believed to be associated with impairment among amygdala and frontal cortex. So when you're talking about executive functioning and discernment in terms of appropriateness and regulating emotion, lower levels of serotonin are associated with poorer discernment and a poorer ability to regulate emotion. And so that's why it is associated with more aggressive behavior that leads toward violence and inappropriateness. Frustration aggression theory. Frustration aggression theory was originally proposed in the 60s, but it was revised substantively, I should say, toward the 70s and moving on into the 80s. And it's essentially, in its revised version, the notion is this. Frustration, which is referred to as the blocking of goal-directed behavior, leads to some form of aggression. And it's really when the frustration is of the unjustified sort that it's going to lead to a form of aggression. So, for example, say you're standing in line at the grocery store, you're trying to get to the checkout line. That's the goal, right? So somebody in front of you is, oh my God, I hate it when people do this, but they got all their stuff on the conveyor belt, ready to get checked out, and then they realize they have forgotten something. So then they want to go back into the store, shopping for this, that, and the third, holding up the whole line. That is so frustrating. Because it's like, You knew you needed X, Y, and Z. You knew that there were all of these people behind you. Why did you make this conscious decision to hold everybody up? That is unjustified frustration. When something like that happens that could have easily been avoided, and it was not absolutely necessary, when something like that happens, we are more likely to become angered. And if there are aggression cues in the atmosphere, like somebody behind you starts cussing under their breath, or somebody maybe behind them starts pushing and shoving, or starts, yelling, "Hey, you," and starts, telling that person off, or starts calling for the manager, or starts telling off the cashier because he or she isn't moving fast enough. When there are those types of cues in the environment, that's going to be the fuel, unfortunately, the gasoline to the match. And so our anger plus those aggression cues is going to exponentially increase the likelihood for us aggressing in that situation. Now remember, forewarned is forearmed. So when you know that, just remember to keep your cool. And just because everybody else is clicking off doesn't mean you need to click off too. So that's my 2 cents there. So this is similar to, or this is not unlike a similar concept, relative deprivation versus deprivation, and the link between those two. Well, the link among those two and the concept of aggression. And so the example from your textbook, which is a really great one, because I was mentioning this to my mom the other day, and she was suggesting when she was a little girl, in her town in Mississippi, not a lot of people had televisions, not the quote unquote richer people or the poorer people. And so for all intents and purposes, whether people were Black or white or perceived to be richer or poorer, there was the perception that to a great extent, everybody's day-to-day experience and lived experience was somewhat similar. So it was a poorer town. So when I say wealthier, I'm not talking about people who were living in 6-bedroom mansions or anything. Compared to shacks, it was not a lot of money to go around, period. So if everybody was coming up short and nobody had a television, or nobody had a color television, or nobody was able to eat meat with every meal, then it's kind of like, well, we all are in the same boat. So yours isn't better than mine, and mine isn't better than yours. So I'm not going to think about running into your house and stealing what you have. But with the advent of, more hierarchy and televisions, and when those became wider spread, people were able to see what beyond what was going on the other side of the tracks, and beyond what was going on across town. People were able to see into Hollywood and the rich and famous and what they were doing in their homes. And so it was at that point that a lot of jealousy and a lot of behavior trying to keep up with the Joneses, so to speak, really began to set in. And so she was just, that concept was resonating with her. But the research and the evidentiary support noted in your chapter was consistent with that, right? So when television became really widespread and people were able to see how the haves lived versus the have-nots, that's when crime really started to skyrocket. Because if people who don't have a lot are able to see that there are others who have quite a bit, and it's overwhelming, and the relative deprivation is highlighted, it does lead to aggression and indignation, and it increases the likelihood of violence. Things like robbery, armed robbery, those types of things are more likely to result. And you don't just see that back in the 1950s. And you see that going on today as well. Okay, so some other prominent theories of aggression, you can see how aggression can be taught. So, with the classical conditioning literature, you can totally see how kids can learn to be bullies, for example. So, if the unconditioned stimulus is having all of the toys, and the unconditioned response is receiving a lot of respect and an admiration because you have all the toys, then the conditioned stimulus could become bullying so that you can get and keep toys, right? So if the bullying becomes associated with that unconditioned response of having respect, then that might lead a kid to learn to be a bully and to learn to continue to be a bully so that he or she could become respected and admired and continue to be respected and admired for, again, having all the toys. Operant conditioning, absolutely, we can totally, unfortunately, reward aggressive behavior. And think about it, we tend to do that in our American society. Just look at the example of football, right? So we put little kids in these pads and we send them out on a field and we cheer for them as they try to take each other out at the knees. I mean, have you ever been to some of those little league types of games and peewee types of games? Those crowds can get pretty brutal, encouraging these little kids to hurt each other. So think about it. If that's the only time the kid gets cheered for and gets applause, he or she is certainly going to learn to be as brutal and aggressive and violent as possible so that he or she can be celebrated. Also, social learning theory suggests we can learn to be aggressive vicariously, meaning through the experiences of others, we can learn to be aggressive. And those are some stats listed there at the bottom of the screen. I will encourage you to read over those. For the sake of time, I won't go through those. Another concept that can help to explain why some people are more aggressive than other people is culture. And as we well know, some cultures encourage violence compared to other cultures discouraging violence. There are some other influences on aggression noted in your chapter, and those include aversive stimuli, arousal, and the media. There are a number of aversive stimuli that have been researched and documented in the literature that have a clear link with increased levels of aggression. Pain is one of them. Think about it. When you're in pain, are you more likely to snap at people? Also, heat. Think about it. When it's cold outside, are you trying to go and run around in the street, fussing and cussing at people? Nah, you're more likely to go home, get somewhere warm, sit down, be quiet. Yep. And also evidentiary support when more riots and looting occurs. It's hot outside. It tends to not occur in the winter months. It usually occurs in like a July or an August. Psychological pain and frustration. According to research, psychological pain and loneliness are registered similarly in the brain to physical pain. Offensive odors, cigarette smoke, also air pollution, right? So when it's hard to breathe, that will produce a very short fuse in people. Also arousal. So reviews Schachter and Singer's work, which suggests physiological arousal is consistent with a number of emotions. And when a person is physiologically aroused, they're going to look to cues in the environment to help them explain what they're feeling and what they should do about it. So when they are physiologically aroused and there are cues for aggression and violence, as we often see, unfortunately, in our American culture and current society, people are going to be more likely to aggress. Also, the media. Things like pornography and things that stop short of pornography, the rape myth, all of those things, unfortunately, increase the likelihood of aggression in a given society. And so I have some statistics there at the bottom of the screen. I encourage you to read over those. Some other influences on aggression. Sometimes in my face-to-face classes, I like to try to replicate some of the research noted in the chapter. And one of those demonstrations is a situation in which I give students a questionnaire that assesses their level of aggression. And then I ask them questions like, what's your favorite type of video game? Is it intellectual, or is it educational, I should say, or is it violent? Is it animated and fun and happy? Is it a war game? I also ask them things like, what's your favorite type of programming to watch? What percentage of the programming that you watch is violent in content? And so they take the questionnaire, assessing their level of aggression, and they answer all of those other questions. And we will real time calculate correlations among those things in class. But you'll read over the literature noted in your textbook that references some correlational and experimental studies, which do support the link between viewing aggressive television programming and increased aggressive thoughts and behaviors. Some other influences on aggression: video games. So like I said, I try to replicate this literature in classrooms, and I have to say I can never quite predict what I'm going to find when I try to do the in-class replications. It's interesting though, overwhelmingly, I would say at least 75% of my students who do play video games say they like violent ones. Now, they may not self-report as violent people, but overwhelmingly they do like violent video games. And this is a research study noted on this slide that examined the link between playing violent video games and aggression. So it was trying to basically address that quintessential question and assertion that some people have, that playing violent video games makes people more violent. And so Anderson suggests that 59% of girls and 73% of boys report their favorite video games are violent. Now that was in 2004, so that was quite a while ago. And as I said, the overwhelming majority of my students report their favorite video games are violent. But in the Bartholomew 2005 paper, essentially what they found was that people who report a high frequency of playing violent video games, after they play a violent video game, they don't have a spike in their self-reported level of aggression. People who don't tend to play a lot of violent video games do report a spike in their level of aggression immediately following playing violent video games. Now, you can interpret that in a number of ways. One way to interpret that is people who play a lot of violent video games are desensitized. And so if they go out and play one, they're not going to see as big a spike or as big a reaction as people who don't play a lot of violent video games. Because people who don't play a lot of violent video games may not be as desensitized as their counterparts. So that's one way to interpret it. Another interpretation is this: just people are different. Some people are more susceptible and vulnerable than others. Another way to think about it might be people who are already given to or drawn to violent tendencies. They're gonna just do a lot more of that on in general. So they're going to play more violent video games, maybe watch more violent movies, talk about more violent stuff, be more violent on average. So there's a number of ways to interpret the research findings, but they're still very interesting to think about. And it would be great to see a more recent replication of that and see how that would pan out, say in 2018. That would be a really neat senior project for an undergrad student, actually. That's a great segue to this case. It's the case of Devin Moore. If you get a chance, Google Devin Moore, because unfortunately, he played a violent video game for hours on end for weeks. It's called Grand Theft Auto. You've probably heard of it. And he had no record. He had not even had a speeding ticket before this particular incident. But he played this violent video game for hours on end, for weeks. And then he gets in the car and he's sleeping. Because again, he's been up day and night playing this video game. So he's weaving all over the road a little bit. So the cops stop him. And they're going to just let him off with a warning. Let his mom come pick up the car. So they stop him. He's already driving sleepy, so they bring him in. Again, they're going to just let him off with a warning, let his mom come pick up the car. While he's at the station, and being processed, he stole an officer's gun, shot 2 officers in the head, and a 911 dispatcher. After he killed those 3 people, he stole a police car and fled the station. Of course, they caught him in a very short period of time, and they were able to take him alive, shockingly. But he told the police after he was captured, quote, "Life is like a video game. Everybody's got to die sometime." That, from what I'm told, is one of the phrases that the key players say in Grand Theft Auto. Excuse me. So this kid commits murder of police officers in a police station with their weapons after playing Grand Theft Auto. And before that, he had absolutely no record. And so his defense was that Grand Theft Auto is a murder simulator. So just like pilots will play video games to help them learn how to fly planes, and it works. And just like sometimes soldiers are taken through combat scenarios in the form of video games to help them prepare for deployment. So just like those things are effective, he said GTA, which is the short term or name for Grand Theft Auto, GTA, said it's a murder simulator. So he blamed the manufacturers. So instead of the state trying him for murder, he wanted, or his lawyers wanted the state to try those manufacturers. It did not work. But if you get a chance, Google that case. It's deafening. So the moral of the story, so to speak, is violent programming, whether it's in the form of television shows or movies or murder simulators like Grand Theft Auto, it gets in, it influences us. Now, of course, not everybody's going to run out and murder 3 people like Devin Moore, but some people are that susceptible. Some people are that vulnerable. So that's why it's so critically important for us to know ourselves, know our friends and family. And if we see something like this spiraling, to say something, step in, try to do some good, right, while it can still be done. But of course, the moral of the story is that violent programming does influence our levels of aggression. excuse me. So some of the explanations for why media violence affects viewers' aggression, the whole if they can do it, so can I mentality that we can learn vicariously by watching other people. Again, desensitization. If we're viewing it over and over, hearing it over and over, we become desensitized to it. Also, that notion that, oh my gosh, if it becomes so ingrained in our minds that the script is one of violence, and if X happens, then B is going to happen. It's like from that movie with Eddie Murphy and Richard Pryor and Della Reese and Red Fox. And so it's this classic scene when Eddie Murphy and Della Reese are fighting. And so she says he claims she's stealing or something like that. And she's like, "Oh, now you coming for my name. Now I gotta cut you. That's the rule." So, and then after that, they get to fighting, and then he shoots her. Anyway, the point is, if in your mind, your mental script is that if X happens, then you have to shoot them, or if X happens, then you have to cut them, or they are automatically going to try to put their hands on you. If that becomes your ingrained understanding of what is supposed to happen and what is going to happen, then of course, you might develop that mentality of, well, this is a sure thing, so I better get them before they get me. Or I need to man up, or I need to pack something or carry something with me so I'm not caught unawares. Unfortunately, when everybody starts thinking that way, we do start backing ourselves into this corner where it's almost impossible to get out of a situation without having to resort to violence. So, we come to perhaps the most important points in this chapter. What are some of the ways we can reduce aggression? Because we live in a world, oh my God, we're seeing some things. I know there's nothing new under the sun, but it just seems like people are taking aggression and violence to levels we've never seen before. So what are some of the ways we can reduce it? Punishment. While it is seemingly it's antithetical, it works. Now, you might not want to punish a child who hits another child by hitting the child because that's just reinforcing the behavior. You want to find a punishment that works and that is effective, but you do need to punish when you should. So a threatened punishment has got to be a sure thing. It's got to be something that is an actual deterrent. Like, don't punish somebody by giving them ice cream. That's not punishment. But punish them with something that is aversive and that is strong enough to be a deterrent. So it's got to be prompt, it's got to be closely associated and in close proximity with whatever the offense is. And they've got to be able to count on that punishment resulting. They can't get out of it. They can't weasel out of it. You can't apply it sometimes to some people and not at other times, or not to certain people. It's got to be a sure thing. When punishment is applied in those ways, it's going to be effective. Also, catharsis. So finding some other way to blow off the steam, that can be effective, but it's got to be done correctly. It's got caveats too. So, for example, if your boss ticks you off, don't go kickboxing, imagining yourself kicking and punching your boss, right? Because that, unfortunately, can increase the likelihood that you might do that one day, and we don't want that to happen. But if you, instead of imagining yourself kicking and punching your boss as you kick and punch a bag or kick and punch somebody else, instead of doing that, maybe go and pick up litter around campus. Blow off the steam by doing something socially constructive. Or blow off the steam by jogging or running or doing something that's nonviolent. Modeling the non-aggressive behavior, right? So children learn what we do, not what we say. They do what we do, not what we say. Same thing for our peers, right? So when you let your light shine, you're giving other people permission implicitly and explicitly to let their lights shine. So be above. When other people go low, you go high. And while it may feel uncomfortable, it really is the best possible thing, because unfortunately, aggression and violence escalate when more and more people feed into it. So, also practicing empathy. Sometimes somebody just may be having a bad day and they may snap at you or click at you or brush up against you and be really rude. Just in that moment, instead of responding, instead of reacting, just take a deep breath. Just accept the apology that was not offered. Forgive the person who is not sorry. Overlook it and just keep it pushing. Because in that moment, maybe they're just in a bad mental space. Maybe they're in a bad emotional space. And just give them the permission to have a bad day and just keep it pushing. Another thing that could possibly reduce aggression, but does not, is the death penalty. And this is only highlighted not because we have the ability to give people the death penalty. We do not. But certainly the states and the federal government take that, well, they take that liberty, pardon the pun, but they shouldn't, because it is not an effective deterrent. And the research cited in your chapter is by Peterson and Bailey from the 1980s. And so what they did was they compared homicide rates during a national hiatus on the death penalty with the time following the Supreme Court's reversal of itself back in the 70s. And what they found was that the return of capital punishment did not impact homicide rates. And the explanation for that is the types of crimes that are death penalty eligible tend to be your hostile or hot aggression types of crimes. So things like murder. So a lot of times murder is a hot aggression resulting behavior. So in that moment, people become so incensed that they click. So it's not the case that they're able to stop and think, wait, OMG, what could possibly result if I do X or if I do Y or if so-and-so happens? It's an instantaneous thing. So that's why the death penalty, or the knowledge that a person could receive the death penalty, is not an effective deterrent against homicide. Now, it might be against other types of crimes that are more instrumental aggression behaviors, but not homicide. So that is the majority of the hot points from chapter 10. Thank you for listening. We did talk about the different forms of aggression. We also talked about some theories that help to explain why aggression exists and why some people are more aggressive than others. We also talked about several things that are believed to significantly influence the likelihood for aggression to result. Then we talked about ways to reduce it, which was, again, perhaps the most critical point of the chapter. Thanks very much, and I'm going to end the recording here.